Good evening and welcome back. Tonight we're stepping into one of the most lavish, most exhausting, most gloriously excessive meals ever thrown by human beings, a genuine Tudor banquet. Not the polite little dinner party your mind might conjure. This is a feast with casualties, swans included. A night where cutlery is a myth, where you'll drink from the same cup as a total stranger, and where a single misplaced elbow could land you in serious trouble with a man who technically owns the ground beneath your boots. Before we drift into it, if you enjoy this kind of slow, detailed wander through history, feel free to like the video and subscribe, only if it genuinely helps you relax. And thank you truly to the listener who requested tonight's subject. This channel exists because of suggestions like yours. Drop a comment below telling me where in the world you're listening from and what time it is right now for you, because somewhere always it's the middle of the night. We're also on Spotify now, so if you'd rather just close your eyes and listen without the screen, there's a link waiting for you in the description. Now turn the lights down low. Let a fan hum somewhere in the background. Get settled under your blanket, because tonight we're asking a few sleepy questions together. Did nobles actually eat swans with the feathers still attached? Was there truly a wrong utensil, and could using it ruin your reputation? What happens when 300 or 400 people are packed into one hall, sharing one enormous meal with no bathroom in sight for nearly 6 hours straight? Could you survive an evening where sugar is currency, meat is a boast, and your seat number quietly tells the whole room exactly how much you matter? Congratulations. You've just been shown to your bench. Welcome to a Tudor banquet. The year is 1533. Henry VIII sits the throne. The wine is already flowing, the etiquette is a minefield, and you are wearing someone else's finest doublet, sweating slightly before you've even sat down. Let's begin. The invitation comes to your door sealed in wax, delivered by a servant who very clearly believes himself above speaking to you directly. A great lord is hosting a banquet, and somehow your name has been placed on the list. Your first feeling is pride. Your second, once the pride fades, is something closer to dread, because an invitation from a nobleman was never really a gift. It was closer to a command dressed up in polite language. You could not refuse someone above you in rank, and in Tudor England, almost everyone technically outranked you. So you write back your grateful acceptance, knowing this single evening will cost you clothing you cannot really afford, a gift you will privately resent buying, and a level of anxiety usually reserved for far more serious occasions. Consider what accepting actually meant. A banquet thrown by a great household wasn't simply a social gathering, it was a performance of power. The host was using the evening to display his wealth, his connections, his place in the world, and every guest he summoned became, whether they liked it or not, a small piece of that display. Being invited was an honor, yes, but it was also a kind of claim being staked on you. You now belonged, however loosely, to his circle of influence, and declining that claim was the sort of insult that got remembered for years. This wasn't a matter of personal preference. Refusing a social superior was read as a direct slight, and slighting a man who held land, title, and the attention of powerful people was an efficient way to shrink your own future. So the reply goes out, warm, thankful, entirely sincere on the surface, while underneath, something cold settles into your chest. It's not unlike being summoned to a mandatory weekend retreat by your employer's employer, except this particular employer could also have you locked away if he felt sufficiently offended. And then the real work begins. What will you wear? Something fine enough to look like you belong, but not so fine that you appear to be reaching above people who could make your life difficult. What will you bring? Arriving at a great man's table with empty hands was simply not done. A gift is required, ideally impressive, almost certainly more than you can spare. How will you even get there? The estate sits a full day's uncomfortable travel away, meaning lost time, lost coin, lost sleep. The money is the quiet terror underneath all of it. A single evening like this could cost a guest of modest means a genuinely painful sum, all for the privilege of being fed while strangers silently size you up. It's a little like being invited to a lavish destination, wedding you cannot afford and cannot decline, where the flight, the outfit and the gift together cost more than a month's wages, and where saying no would end a relationship you can't risk losing. So you spend. You plan. You worry over unanswerable questions. Why exactly were you invited? Is this an honor or a test, or simply a way to pad out a crowded hall with more warm bodies? You'll turn this over in your mind for days without ever reaching a satisfying answer, because in a world built entirely on rank and favor, no invitation is ever just an invitation. Still, you commit. You empty your coin purse, you prepare your finest borrowed garments, you rehearse the correct depth of bow, and you set off down a long, muddy road toward a meal specifically designed to remind you exactly where you stand. You haven't taken a single bite yet, and already the evening has cost you sleep, savings, and peace of mind. Somewhere, a nobleman is enormously pleased with himself, and you are quietly the reason why. Dressing for the evening now comes the genuinely complicated part, getting dressed, because Tudor England had actual laws about what a person was permitted to wear. These were called sumptuary laws, and they dictated, in exhausting detail, which fabrics, furs, and colors belonged to which ranks of society. Certain purples were reserved essentially for royalty. Certain furs, certain golds, certain dyes, all fenced off for your betters. Wear the wrong one and you weren't simply tasteless. You were technically breaking the law, so you layer yourself into heavy hose and a stiff, upright collar that could double as servingware, trying to strike an impossible balance, wealthy enough to deserve your invitation, modest enough not to accidentally commit a legal offense with your own shirt. Sit with how strange that is for a moment. You've spent money you didn't really have trying to look prosperous, and now you must be careful not to look too prosperous. The entire point of these laws was to keep rank visible at a glance. Clothing wasn't self-expression, it was closer to a uniform, broadcasting exactly who you were, and just as importantly, who you were not. Imagine if the color of your jacket today were legally tied to your job title, and wearing the wrong shade risked an actual fine. That was the Tudor wardrobe. The richest crimsons, the deepest purples, cloth threaded with real gold, luxurious furs like sable, all of it locked away for the highest ranks, while everyone beneath made do with permitted colors and cheaper cloth. Getting dressed becomes a nervous negotiation with an invisible rulebook. Too plain and you shame yourself. Too grand and you risk shamming or offending someone above you who might take your fine collar as a personal insult. There's a narrow, uncomfortable path between the two, and you're expected to walk it flawlessly. Then there's the sheer physical weight of the clothing itself. A gentleman's outfit was practically an engineering project. A linen shirt, a padded doublet fitted close to the body, tight hose, perhaps a jerkin or gown layered over the top, and a high, stiff collar rising toward the jaw. It's heavy. It's warm, and you will be wearing every layer of it inside a packed, fire-lit hall for the better part of 6 hours. You are, in effect, dressing for a marathon while dressed as a piece of furniture. Everything must also look immaculate, because the cut of your cloth and the neatness of your stitching broadcast your worth to a room full of people who have spent their entire lives learning to judge exactly that. A frayed hem or a wrinkled shirt tells the whole hall that you are struggling, and struggling is the one impression you cannot afford to give. By the time you're finally dressed, you are something close to a monument to effort and quiet anxiety, restricted in movement, faintly sweating, painfully aware that your outfit is itself a kind of public statement. You take one last look, straighten the collar that is already working against you, and step outside to face a journey that will undo most of this effort within the hour. The road, because between you and that glowing, torchlit hall lies a genuinely miserable stretch of road, and it does not care in the slightest about your careful legal compliance. You travel by horse if you're fortunate enough to own one, or on foot if you're not, along tracks that are less roads, and more long-standing agreements between mud and gravity. Tudor England had no paved highways, no signposts, no dependable surface of any kind, only old paths worn down over centuries by feet, hooves, and cart wheels, entirely at the mercy of the weather. In dry weeks, the ground turns into hardened, ankle-twisting ruts. In wet weeks, which is most weeks, it becomes a slow, sucking mess that swallows boots whole and turns every mile into a small ordeal. If you're on horseback, you'll spend hours being jolted through the saddle while your carefully assembled outfit slowly acquires a layer of road grime. If you're walking, it's worse still. You arrive footsore, damp with sweat, and coated to the knee in whatever the track happened to be made of that day. Either way, the composed, well-dressed guest who left home that morning is not quite the same person who eventually arrives. The distances themselves are punishing. A great lord's estate might sit a full day's travel away, meaning you're not just enduring bad roads, you're racing daylight while enduring them. Leave too late, and you risk finishing the journey after dark, on unlit paths, where a wrong step or a hidden ditch could end your evening early and unpleasantly. Robbery was a real enough concern that travelers tried to move in groups whenever possible, since numbers were the only real insurance available. And the weather, of course, does not negotiate. There is no forecast to check, no rescheduling for rain. You travel through whatever the sky decides to do, and a sudden downpour can turn a merely unpleasant trip into a genuinely miserable one. Then finally, the house appears, rising out of the darkness ahead, windows glowing gold with candlelight, chimneys breathing smoke into the night sky, the entire enormous silhouette announcing the wealth of the man who lives inside it. For one honest moment after hours in the mud and dark, it's a genuinely beautiful sight and your spirits lift. Then you glance down at yourself, the mud, the sweat, the ruined finery you spent so much to assemble, and your heart sinks straight back down. So you do what every tired, muddy traveler across history has done. You pause just short of the entrance, scrape the worst of the filth from your hose, straighten a collar that refuses to cooperate, and rearrange your face into the practiced expression of someone who arrived fresh, composed, and entirely unbothered. It won't fully work, but nobody around you is really fooled either, because every other guest just survived the same road. You square your shoulders and you step into the light, ready to perform an ease you do not currently feel. You step through the screen's passage and into the great hall itself. And for one honest, unguarded moment, it actually works. The fear falls away and something closer to awe takes its place. The room is vast, far vaster than anything you're used to standing inside. Overhead, a timber roof soars up into the shadows, ribbed with great oak beams crossing and interlocking in the elaborate style carpenters called a hammer beam roof. The walls are hung, floor to ceiling, with woven tapestries, enormous scenes of hunts, battles, saints, and biblical stories glowing faintly in the candlelight, some of them threaded through with actual silver and gold. Long tables run the length of the hall for guests like you, and at the very far end, raised up on a wooden platform, sits the head table, where the truly important people will eat while looking down, quite literally, on everyone below them. It is dazzling. It is also, you slowly realize, entirely intentional. Nothing about this room is accidental. Every inch of it was designed for exactly one purpose, to make you feel small the instant you walked in, and it is working precisely as planned. Take a moment and really look up, because everyone does. That roof, soaring far higher than any dining room could possibly need, is a masterpiece of carpentry, and the height itself is the whole point. It's the Tudor equivalent of a cathedral ceiling, built not because anyone needed the extra air, but because enclosing so much magnificent, useless space was itself a way of announcing what the host could afford. You're meant to crane your neck and feel appropriately humbled by a man wealthy enough to build rooms this enormous just to eat dinner in. Then there are the tapestries. These weren't decoration in any casual sense. They were staggering, portable fortunes hung on display. A single well-made tapestry could cost more than an ordinary family might see across an entire lifetime. And here you are, standing surrounded by dozens of them at once, each one a small monument to money. To walk into this hall is to walk directly into the middle of somebody else's wealth, displayed on every wall at once. The layout tells its own quiet story too. Long tables stretch out for the general run of guests, while at the far end, everything rises. That raised platform, called the dais, physically lifts the host and his most honored companions above everyone else in the room, so that rank becomes something you can literally see with your own eyes the moment you walk in. Height equals importance, and the architecture makes the hierarchy of the evening obvious before a single word has been spoken. There's noise, too, and warmth and constant motion. Fires roar in enormous hearths along the walls. Servants move through the crowd with the practiced efficiency of people who have done this 100 times before. Candlelight catches on an elaborate display of gold and silver plate arranged along a sideboard, sometimes called a cupboard or buffet, vessels stacked purely to be admired, never touched, never used. Another quiet boast in a room already full of them. And as you stand there, small and still faintly muddy from the road, you become aware that you too are being watched. Eyes flick toward the doorway as each new guest arrives, sizing up the cut of their cloth, the company they keep, the way they carry themselves. This hall isn't only a stage for the host, it's a stage for everyone in it, and you've just stepped onto it whether you meant to or not. You straighten your shoulders, arrange your expression, and take your first steps into the machine, hopping quietly that it doesn't chew you up before the food has even arrived. Finding your seat now comes the quietest, most brutal moment of the whole evening, discovering exactly where you rank, without a single word being spoken aloud. On the head table sits a large, ornate salt cellar, often wrought in silver, sometimes genuinely a work of art in its own right, placed there with real ceremony. And your entire worth as a guest tonight is measured, instantly and silently, by which side of it you end up sitting on. Sit above the salt, closer to the host, closer to the finest dishes, and you matter. Sit below it, down toward the drafty far end with the lesser guests and the tougher cuts of meat, and the entire hall now quietly understands your rank without anyone having to announce it. Salt itself was valuable enough in this period to deserve an elaborate vessel, but the cellar's true function was social rather than culinary. It was a dividing line drawn straight across the seating plan, those who mattered on one side, those who merely attended on the other, and the cruelty of it lies entirely in its silence. No herald stands up and reads out the guest rankings. Nobody needs to, because the whole room reads a seating chart fluently. Everyone present understands immediately what it means that you've been placed where you've been placed, and everyone notices in the same instant. It is, in many ways, the direct ancestor of 100 small modern anxieties. Think of the wedding guest quietly seated by the kitchen doors, the office worker whose desk placement reveals exactly how replaceable they are, the party guest who slowly realizes they've been filed under acquaintance rather than friend. We still play this exact game today. The Tudors simply built it into the architecture and handed the referee duties to a very large silver salt cellar. For a guest, this makes the actual act of sitting down genuinely tense. You approach the tables trying to read the arrangement, hoping you've landed higher than you feared and dreading you've landed lower than you hoped, entirely without any say in the matter. The decision was made by the host's household long before you arrived, and now you simply discover the verdict in public, doing your best to arrange your face into neutral acceptance no matter which way it goes. And once you're seated, that position holds for the rest of the night, a fixed, unmoving reminder of exactly where you stand. Sit above the salt, and you'll spend the evening quietly pleased, and just as quietly anxious about whether you truly deserve it. Sit below it, and you'll spend the night aware of every richer dish and warmer seat further up the hall, just out of reach. Either way, you've learned your worth in the host's eyes before a single course has even been served, washing your hands before anything reaches your plate, or rather your bread, since plates in the modern sense are largely absent. A servant approaches carrying a jug and basin, pouring scented water gently over your waiting fingers. How thoughtful, you think at first. How refined. Then the logic of it settles in. There are no forks at this table. In a matter of minutes, you will be tearing meat, pinching morsels, and dragging bread through communal sauce using nothing but your bare hands. Those hands need to begin the evening clean because they are about to become the primary tool for the entire meal. This isn't pampering. It's closer to scrubbing and before surgery, dressed up in rosewater and silver. The ritual itself carries its own etiquette. You don't simply plunge your hands into the basin and splash about. You hold them out politely to be poured over, rinse with a certain composed dignity, and dry them on the offered cloth without making a production of it. Fumbling, even this small moment marked a guest as unused to good company, and people noticed. Even getting clean, it turns out, was a small performance you could fail at. And because your hands will be filthy again within the hour, this ritual repeats throughout the evening, servants circling back between the great waves of courses to rinse away the grease and sauce accumulated so far, giving you a brief, fragrant reset before the next assault begins. It's worth remembering this wasn't hygiene in any modern sense. The water was often shared down the table, the towel passed between neighbors, and the era's understanding of how illness actually spread was, charitably, non-existent. Still, given the alternative sauce-caked fingers touching shared dishes all evening, a bit of scented water was a genuine mercy for everyone at the table. There's something almost touching about the whole arrangement, once you sit with it a moment. This entire elaborate, perfumed ceremony exists purely because the fork hadn't caught on yet in England, and the refinement of the Tudor table was built not to eliminate the problem of eating with your hands, but to dress that problem up so beautifully that nobody had to think of it as a problem at all. No fork switch brings us to the empty space where your fork should be. There isn't one. Forks did exist. Fashionable diners in Italy had already begun adopting them, but the English largely regarded the fork as a strange, faintly ridiculous foreign affectation, the sort of thing a suspiciously well-traveled cousin might bring home to show off. Your toolkit for the evening consists of a spoon, a knife you were likely expected to bring yourself, and the 10 fingers you were born with. You will spend the night tearing, pinching, and scooping your way through an entire feast, and so will everyone else in the hall, which at least makes the situation communal rather than embarrassing. Sit with how strange this actually is for a modern diner to picture. You glance down at your place expecting the familiar arrangement of cutlery, and find, at best, a single spoon and nothing else, no neat row of forks, no separate tool for each course, none of the quiet choreography we now take entirely for granted. The knife becomes your main precision instrument, used for cutting and occasionally for spearing food directly to your mouth on its point, which is exactly as risky as it sounds. The spoon handles anything liquid, pottages, sauces, thick stews. And your fingers do everything else, which, at a meal built almost entirely around whole roasted animals, turns out to be most of it. This is precisely why the hand-washing mattered so much, and why the etiquette guides fussed endlessly over exactly how your fingers were meant to behave. Use only certain fingers. Don't grab. Don't cram food in. Keep your handling neat and unhurried. Eating gracefully with your hands was a genuine trainable skill, and doing it clumsily marked you instantly as poorly bred. Picture the whole hall engaged in this at once, hundreds of guests dressed in their finest clothing, all pinching, tearing and dipping with bare fingers, licking grease from their thumbs, wiping hands discreetly on cloth and bread. To modern eyes, it might look faintly chaotic. Within the actual rules of the room, though, it was perfectly civilized. Elegance here was never about the tools available. It was entirely about the composure you showed while using none. The trencher looked down at the thick slab sitting in front of you. That isn't a snack. That is your plate. It's called a trencher, a dense, deliberately stale slice of bread cut specifically to absorb the coming flood of juices, sauces, and grease. By the end of the meal, it will be a heavy, soaked disc holding the memory of everything you've eaten, and depending on your appetite and your manners, you might finish it yourself, or leave it behind to be collected and given to the hungry crowd waiting at the gate. The genius of the trencher becomes obvious once you set modern assumptions aside. Pottery and pewter plates did exist, and the grandest tables sometimes used them, but bread was cheap, plentiful, and required no washing afterward. A great household could bake trenchers by the hundred, deploy them across an entire hall, and dispose of the mess at the end of the night without scrubbing a single dish. As a solution for feeding an enormous crowd, It's remarkably efficient. Watch what happens to yours over the course of the evening. It begins firm and respectable. Then the meal begins in earnest, juices from the meat soak steadily into the crumb, dark sauces pool and spread, grease from roast after roast seeps deeper in. By the later courses, your once solid slab has become a heavy, saturated, dripping thing, dense with the flavor of your entire dinner. And here manners and hunger quietly collide. A guest of modest means, genuinely hungry, might well eat the soaked trencher at the end, sauce and all, treating it as an accidental final course. A grander guest, eager to signal that they were far too well fed to bother, would leave it untouched. Neither choice carried real shame, but both said something quiet about the guest making it, as almost everything at this table did. The leftover trenchers weren't wasted. They were gathered along with other scraps and handed out as charity to the poor waiting outside the great house, a practice we'll return to later in the evening. So your bread plate lives an entire small life cycle of its own, baked deliberately stale, used as dinnerware, soaked through by the feast, and finally passed on to someone genuinely hungry at the gate. Few objects at the banquet were used quite so thoroughly. To modern sensibilities, the trencher sits somewhere between clever and faintly unsettling. A zero-waste dining solution centuries before the phrase existed, and also a slab of bread quietly marinating in communal grease for hours. It's genuinely both at once, which turns out to be a fair description of most things at a Tudor feast. Tudor diners had their own etiquette guides, small courtesy books that spelled out, in exhausting detail, exactly how not to discuss the people sitting beside you. And the very existence of these rules tells you everything you need to know about how people were actually behaving. The instructions go on and on. Don't scratch yourself at the table. Don't pick your teeth with the point of your knife. Don't blow your nose on the tablecloth, which was apparently tempting enough to require an explicit warning. Don't lunge for the best dish before your neighbors have had a chance. Don't speak with your mouth full of half-chewed capon. Every gesture, it seems, was being watched and silently judged, and one clumsy slip could brand you a bore for the remainder of the evening. Here's the delightfully telling thing about these guides. Nobody writes down, "Don't blow your nose on the tablecloth," unless somebody, somewhere, was cheerfully doing exactly that on a fairly regular basis. So these little manuals of refined behavior double, quite by accident, as a hilarious catalog of everything that kept going wrong at the Tudor table. It's oddly comforting across the centuries, honestly proof that people have always needed to be told, in writing, not to be revolting at dinner. The rules cover territory we'd consider fairly basic today, and then some. Don't scratch yourself suggests guests regularly arrived with fleas and limited self-control. Don't pick your teeth with your knife, the very same knife you're eating with, implies this was a genuinely common habit. Don't spit. Don't belch loudly. Don't wipe greasy fingers on your own clothing when a napkin sits within easy reach. The bar for acceptable behavior, it turns out, sat rather lower than you might expect from a room full of people dressed in their most expensive finery. Then there are the rules specifically governing the shared food, which loom over almost every gesture you make tonight. Don't lunge for the finest morsel like a starving animal. Don't take more than your fair portion. Don't reach directly across your neighbor's plate. Don't handle the communal dishes in a way that might put everyone else off their appetite. Because so much of this meal is shared, your manners were never purely your own business. They directly affected whether the people around you could keep eating comfortably at all. And there are the eternal, universal rules that need no historical explanation whatsoever. Don't speak with your mouth full. Don't cram food in. Don't chew loudly or slurp or turn eating into a spectacle. Anyone who has ever sat across from a noisy eater at a modern dinner table already understands these instincts perfectly well. The Tudors simply had to write them down formally, because the stakes of offending the wrong person at this table were considerably higher than a mildly awkward glance across the room. That's really the weight sitting behind all of it. This was never etiquette purely for its own sake. It was survival, in a world where your reputation followed you everywhere and everyone above you in rank was quietly watching. A single clumsy, crude, or careless move at the table could mark you as lowborn, unrefined, not the sort of person a great man wants anywhere near his circle. Good manners were the visible proof of your worth, and a single lapse could undo, in one greasy instant, the fortune you'd already spent on clothes and travel just to be here. So you eat under constant quiet surveillance, essentially monitoring your own hands as though they belong to someone else. You keep your fingers neat, your knife respectable, your chewing silent, your reaching modest. You resist every small itch and urge that might give you away. It is, frankly, exhausting, this constant performance of refinement, especially hours in, once you're full and warm and several cups of wine deep, and your careful control is beginning to fray at the edges. You glance around the hall and notice everyone else performing exactly as hard, all of you politely pretending this feels effortless, all of you one lapse away from becoming the cautionary tale the courtesy book warned about. Sharing everything personal space, as a concept, simply does not exist here, and neither does the idea of a plate that belongs only to you. Dishes are set out communally, meant for entire groups of diners to reach into together. You share a drinking cup with your neighbor, which means their personal habits are now, unavoidably, your problem too. You break bread, sometimes quite literally, with the stranger seated beside you, and there are firm, unbending rules around the resulting mess. Never dip your already bitten bread back into the shared sauce for a second time, and for heaven's sake, never return a bone you've been gnawing on to the communal dish. This isn't polite suggestion. It's closer to a trust exercise disguised as dinner, and trust, several cups of ale in, tends to run rather thin. Start with the food arrangement itself, because the communal setup shapes the entire meal. Dishes were never plated individually and placed before each guest the way we're used to today. Instead, they were set out on the table for small groups to share, and you served yourself from these common platters directly onto your own trencher. A cluster of diners eating together this way was often called a mess, which meant your dinner was less a private experience and more a shared undertaking with whoever happened to be seated near you that evening, chosen or not. The shared cup makes things especially intimate. Rather than each guest having an individual vessel, cups and goblets were frequently passed back and forth between neighbors throughout the meal. This meant a neighbor's cleanliness, or their lack of it, became a very direct and personal concern. Their greasy lips, their crumbs, whatever state of health they happened to be in, all of it arrived with the shared cup. The courtesy books, naturally, instructed guests to wipe their mouth carefully before drinking, so as not to leave a slick of grease along the rim for the next person's lips. Considerate when followed, genuinely unpleasant when it wasn't. This is precisely why two particular rules around sharing carried such weight. First, no double dipping. Once your bread had touched your mouth, it did not go back into the communal sauce for anyone else to encounter. Second, and even more firmly enforced, no returning a chewed bone or scrap to a shared dish. These weren't polite suggestions. They were the load-bearing rules that made the entire arrangement of communal eating bearable at all. Consider what those two rules were really protecting. When an entire table eats from the same platters and drinks from the same cups, a single careless guest can ruin the meal for everyone sharing that dish. One person redunking chewed bread, one person tossing a sucked-clean bone back among the meat. And suddenly nobody at that end of the table wants to reach in again. The whole system depends entirely on everyone quietly agreeing to behave. A considerable amount of faith to place in a table full of near strangers, some of whom are already several cups deep into the wine. It also erases any notion of personal space entirely. Guests sit shoulder to shoulder on long benches, elbows negotiating constantly for room, reaching into the same dishes, drinking from shared vessels with people they barely know. The modern instinct toward a personal plate, a personal glass, a small bubble of individual space would have genuinely baffled a Tudor diner. Eating here was communal, physical, and close, a social act in the most literal possible sense. For us, looking back, the whole arrangement reads as a quietly nerve-wracking exercise in blind trust. You're trusting the stranger beside you to wipe their mouth before drinking, trusting the man across from you not to redunk his bread, trusting that nobody in your particular cluster of diners is about to do something that ruins the meal for the rest of you. In an age with almost no real understanding of how illness actually spreads, that trust was extended fairly blindly, cup after shared cup. So you settle in among your assigned table mates, keeping one weary eye on the communal dishes and a firm grip on your own manners. You wipe your lips carefully before drinking. You keep your bitten bread to yourself. You resist any urge to reclaim a discarded bone. And you quietly hope everyone else nearby was raised on the same courtesy books, because for the next several hours, their manners are very much your problem too. The first wave in the food finally arrives, and here comes the twist that changes everything you thought you understood about how a meal is supposed to work. A Tudor course isn't a single dish. It's a flood. What Tudor households called a course, or sometimes a remove, meant dozens of separate dishes carried out and crowded onto the tables all at once. Roasts, pies, stews, whole fish, entire birds, all landing together in one overwhelming avalanche of food. There is no gentle packing here, no polite sequence of starter, then main, then something sweet at the end. It is, quite simply, an ambush. You survey the sudden landscape spread before you, realize with a sinking feeling that at least 2 more waves like this are still coming, and quietly accept that your stomach is about to be tested in ways it has never faced before. Let go entirely of whatever assumptions you carry about how a meal is meant to be structured, because the Tudors approached it completely differently. Today we tend to eat in a tidy sequence, one course cleared cleanly before the next appears, a gentle build from small to large to sweet. A Tudor course threw all of that logic out entirely. When a course was announced, everything belonging to it arrived at once, dish after dish after dish, until the tables groaned audibly under the accumulated weight. So the first wave lands, and it is genuinely overwhelming. Servants stream in from the kitchens in a steady procession, arranging roasts beside pies, beside stews, beside whole fish, beside towers of roasted fowl, packing every inch of table surface until there's barely enough room left for your own trencher. This isn't a plate of food set before you. It's an entire landscape of it, spread across the whole table for your group to reach into together. The effect is meant to stun, and every single time it does exactly that. There's no real guidance on where to even begin. Faced with this sheer abundance, you simply choose reaching for whatever sits nearest, or whatever looks most appealing, or whatever you can actually get to without committing a manners violation by lunging across your neighbor's arm. You pile a bit of this and a bit of that onto your already soaking trencher, sampling widely, trying to pace yourself, which becomes nearly impossible once the sheer variety keeps tempting you toward just one more small taste. And then, just as the fullness begins to properly settle in, the entire spread is cleared away and replaced. That's the remove, the clearing of one course's flood of dishes, followed immediately by the arrival of the next. A second wave crashes in, another dozen or more dishes, another entire landscape of food, and your stomach lurches at the growing realization that the first round was merely a warm-up act. The logic behind all this chaos comes back, once again, to display. A table buried under dozens of simultaneous dishes was an undeniable, visible statement of the host's wealth and generosity. It hardly mattered that no single guest could possibly eat more than a small fraction of it. The entire point was the abundance itself, the overwhelming, almost aggressive plenty of it all. More dishes meant more visible status, and hosts competed openly to bury their tables deeper than any rival ever could. For you, though, the reality is a stomach under genuine siege. There's no natural rhythm here to help you pace yourself, no reassuring sequence signaling that the end is anywhere near. Just wave after wave of rich, heavy food, each one arriving before you've fully recovered from the last. You learn quickly that restraint is your only real ally, and that trying to do justice to everything in front of you is a fool's errand that ends only in misery an hour later. So you steel yourself, survey the next incoming wave, and adopt the only sensible strategy available: taste, don't gorge. You sample the highlights, pace your reaching carefully, and mentally brace for whatever is still coming. Somewhere above the salt, a seasoned guest is doing exactly the same, nibbling wisely, while newcomers overload their trenchers and regret it within the hour. You resolve quietly to be the wise one, and the peacock, you remind yourself, hasn't even arrived yet. A mountain of meat. Let's talk about the meat, because there is a genuinely staggering, almost aggressive quantity of it in front of you. Beef, mutton, venison, wild boar, capon, rabbit, and small roasted songbirds you are apparently expected to eat more or less whole. To Tudor sensibilities, meat was wealth made edible, a way of shouting your status through sheer volume of dead animal piled across a table. Vegetables, meanwhile, were considered food for the poor, and were largely absent from the top tables entirely. Don't go looking for a modest salad tonight. You are here to eat flesh in quantities that would genuinely alarm a modern doctor, and to look thoroughly delighted about it the entire evening. Survey what's actually spread before you, and the ambition of it is almost comical. There's beef and mutton, the reliable backbone of any great feast. There's venison, prized precisely because deer were hunted on private land, and serving it announced access to that exclusive privilege. There's wild boar, capon, a fattened rooster rabbit, and what feels like an entire aviary of small birds. The sheer variety alone functions as a boast, each different animal another line in the host's unwritten resume of wealth. Then there are the small birds, which take some genuine getting used to. Larks, thrushes, and other tiny songbirds, roasted whole and served to be eaten more or less entirely, small bones included. To modern sensibilities, this is startling. To a Tudor diner, it was a genuine delicacy, a fiddly, flavorful mouthful that spoke to the reach and ambition of a kitchen willing to trap and prepare creatures we'd now simply shoo out of a garden. You pick one up, regard it with some wariness, and understand quite clearly that squeamishness has no place at tonight's table. Understanding why meat mattered this much reveals the entire underlying philosophy of the feast in miniature. In Tudor thinking, meat was status rendered edible. The wealthy consumed flesh in enormous quantities precisely because they could, because it was expensive, because it demanded land, hunting rights, and a kitchen full of genuinely skilled hands. Piling a table with roast after roast was a direct way of shouting your wealth through sheer volume of dead animal, and the message landed clearly with every guest in the hall, which brings us to the conspicuous absence of anything green. Where exactly are the vegetables, the greens, the modest portion of something that actually grew from the ground? Largely nowhere, at least not at the top tables. Vegetables carried the unmistakable whiff of peasant food, the humble staple the poor relied on because they couldn't afford anything richer. A great man displaying his status through mountains of meat had little interest in cluttering his table with the very foods that marked people beneath him. The result for you is a meal that leans overwhelmingly toward flesh in a way that would genuinely worry a modern physician. Course after course, dish after dish, all protein and fat and richness, with almost nothing to balance it out. There's bread, certainly, and your trencher steadily soaking up the juices and heavy sauces, but the sensible, fibrous portion of a modern plate is simply nowhere to be found. This is a diet built entirely to impress, not to sustain. And you are expected throughout to appear thoroughly delighted by all of it. This is a treat, an honor, a generous display, and looking anything less than thrilled at the sheer tide of meat would strike everyone around you as both rude and genuinely confusing. So you eat, you praise, you marvel, all while your body quietly wonders exactly what you've done to it tonight. You take a piece of venison here, a bit of capon there, a cautious nibble of a whole tiny roasted bird, and you perform gratitude for a meal that amounts, essentially, to an avalanche of animal. It is wealth you can chew, and tonight, you are chewing through someone else's fortune. Now comes the centerpiece, and it is a bird you will genuinely never forget, though not entirely for the reasons the kitchen intended. A peacock or a swan roasted through, then carefully skinned and dressed back into its own feathers so that it appears from a distance to still be alive, proud, magnificent, gleaming under the candlelight. It is a genuine spectacle. It is also, by nearly every honest historical account, close to inedible, tough, dry, and stringy beneath all that plumage. But taste was never remotely the point. This was pure theater, a feathered flex engineered to make the entire hall gasp in unison. You take a polite, careful bite, smile your way through the leathery texture, and quietly understand that some dishes exist to be eaten, and others exist purely to be witnessed. Watch the hall as the bird is carried in, because the entrance itself is the whole event. A peacock or swan, roasted and then painstakingly reassembled inside its own skin and feathers, arrives borne aloft on a great platter, crafted to look from across the hall like a living bird in full magnificent display. Sometimes the beak was even gilded, or a small wick fitted inside to breathe a thin plume of fire as it entered. The room reacts exactly as intended, a ripple of genuine astonishment, a murmur of admiration rolling down the tables, every eye fixed on the host's extraordinary centerpiece. The work behind it was genuinely impressive. The kitchen had to skin the bird with real care, preserving the feathered hide intact, roast the body separately, and then reassemble the whole creature so convincingly that it appeared ready to strut straight off the platter. It's part cookery, part taxidermy, part pure theater, and it demanded serious skill from everyone involved. A household capable of producing something like this was announcing, quite loudly, that it employed cooks of genuine artistry, another feather, quite literally, in the host's cap. And then, of course, someone actually has to taste it. Here's the part that history rarely dwells on. Peacock and swan, by most honest accounts, are simply not good eating. The meat runs tough, dry, and stringy, a chewy disappointment following all that visual grandeur. These were never birds bred for the table the way a plump capon was. They were birds bred entirely for the eye. The gap between how the dish looked and how it actually tasted was enormous, and everyone at the table quietly understood this without saying so aloud. But taste, as you're coming to understand, was never really the goal here. This dish existed purely as spectacle, a showpiece meant to dazzle rather than nourish, designed to give the evening a centerpiece people would still be talking about days later. Whether it was genuinely pleasant to eat was almost beside the point entirely. A plain, delicious dish could never accomplish what a magnificent, mediocre-tasting peacock could. So you're offered a small piece, and you face a minor social test. You eat it with every visible sign of pleasure. You do not grimace at the dryness. You do not comment on the stringy texture. You smile, you nod, perhaps you even offer an admiring word about the presentation, because to do otherwise would be to miss the entire point of the dish and insult the considerable effort behind it. There's something wonderfully absurd about the whole scene once you step back from it. A room full of wealthy, powerful people all admiring and dutifully eating a bird that nearly everyone privately finds unpleasant, purely because of how spectacular it looks reassembled in its own feathers. It's not so different, really, from a modern dish designed entirely for the photograph rather than the plate. Beautiful, impressive, and not actually all that nice. Some things, it turns out, never really change. The cost of spice. The food arriving in front of you is heavily, almost aggressively spiced, and the reason has nothing to do with the story you may have heard. Forget the popular myth that spices existed to disguise rotting meat. The wealthy could easily afford fresh meat, and had no need whatsoever to serve anything spoiled to their honored guests. The real explanation is far simpler and far more purely Tudor. Money. Pepper, cinnamon, ginger, cloves, and saffron were extraordinarily expensive, hauled across enormous distances at tremendous cost. Drenching a dish in them was, essentially, setting fire to cash directly in front of your guests. Every dish tonight arrives perfumed, sweetened, and gilded with spice. Less about flavor, and much more about quietly announcing that your host is wealthy enough to season the very air itself. Let's dismiss the old myth properly first, because it persists stubbornly. You've likely heard that medieval and Tudor cooks buried food in spices to mask meat that had gone bad. It's a tidy story, and largely untrue for a table like this one. The wealthy could afford freshly slaughtered meat, and had no reason to serve anything spoiled to guests they were actively trying to impress. Spices here were never a cover-up. They were, in fact, the exact opposite of desperation. The real reason is far more straightforward and far more revealing about the whole evening. Spices were extraordinarily expensive, and using them lavishly was simply a way of showing off. Pepper, cinnamon, ginger, cloves, nutmeg, and above all saffron traveled from distant corners of the world, passing through long chains of merchants, each one adding their own markup along the way. By the time a single pinch reached an English kitchen, it had crossed an extraordinary distance and cost an extraordinary sum. To season heavily was, quite literally, to spend heavily. Drenching your dinner in spice functioned as a direct display of wealth burned in front of your guests, and every richly perfumed dish silently announced exactly how much the host could afford to lavish on a single evening. It was conspicuous consumption in its purest, most fragrant form, wealth you could taste and smell, a boast dissolved right into the sauce. Saffron deserves particular attention here, because it functioned as the absolute crown jewel of this edible boasting, worth, at times, close to its weight in gold. Saffron turned dishes a rich, unmistakable golden yellow, a color that read instantly as pure luxury to anyone at the table. Serving food gilded gold with saffron was serving something that looked as precious as it actually was, a visual and financial flex rolled into a single shimmering dish. Every guest understood exactly what that golden hue represented in terms of cost. The result on your trencher is food that tastes and smells almost nothing like modern English cooking. Dishes arrive sweet and savory simultaneously, perfumed with cinnamon and ginger, warmed through with pepper, colored deep gold with saffron, in combinations that might strike a modern palate as strange, even faintly overwhelming. Meat might arrive sweetened. Sauces blend flavors we'd now keep firmly separated. This is a cuisine built entirely around abundance and display rather than the restrained balance we tend to value today. And this connects directly back to everything you've already noticed about this hall. Just as the peacock existed purely to be looked at, the spices existed purely to be spent on. A great banquet was, from beginning to end, a performance of wealth, from the seating arrangement to the sauces. And heavy spicing was simply one more instrument in that orchestra of quiet boasting. The host wasn't seasoning to please anyone's tongue so much as to impress an entire watching audience. So you eat your intensely, exotically spiced dinner, your senses gently overwhelmed by sweetness and perfume in equal measure, and you recognize the message baked into every single mouthful. This isn't seasoning in any ordinary sense. It's spending, made edible. Every fragrant, golden, richly spiced dish is the host quietly reminding the entire hall of the fortune he's willing to burn simply to feed you tonight. Fish days. Depending on which day this banquet falls on, the entire meaty spectacle in front of you might technically be forbidden. The church mandated fish days, meatless days like Fridays, all of Lent, and various scattered fasts throughout the year, when devout Christians were expected to abstain from the flesh of land animals. Tudor households, however, were not remotely willing to let religious observance ruin a good party. So fish days became their own strange kind of extravagance, helped along by a wonderfully loose definition of exactly what counted as fish. Religion, it turns out, had firm opinions about your dinner. The church laid down a calendar of meatless days, when devout Christians abstained from the flesh of land animals entirely. Fridays were the obvious example, but there were many more certain other weekdays in some observances, the entire long stretch of Lent, and various additional fasts scattered throughout the year. On these days, all that beef and venison and roasted fowl simply vanished from the table, a religious rule no respectable household would openly ignore. You might reasonably expect this to mean a humble, penitent meal, a modest portion of plain fish eaten in quiet restraint. And in theory, that was indeed the spirit behind the rule, a small sacrifice, a turning away from the pleasures of rich eating. But this is a Tudor banquet, and Tudor cooks were simply not inclined to let a holy day ruin a good evening. If meat was forbidden, then the fish would simply have to become spectacular in its own right, and it did. Fish days at a great house transformed into their own kind of extravagant feast. Kitchens produced an astonishing range of seafood and freshwater fish, dressed up with the exact same expensive spices and rich sauces as everything else on the menu. Pike, carp, eel, salmon, dishes built from every finned creature the kitchen could source, prepared with as much artistry and expense as any meat course served on an ordinary evening. The letter of the rule was obeyed precisely, while its penitent spirit was cheerfully, thoroughly ignored. And here's the loophole that makes the whole arrangement genuinely delightful. The medieval and Tudor definition of fish was gloriously, opportunistically flexible. What mattered in practice was whether a creature lived in water. If it swam in the sea, it counted as fish, regardless of what it actually was biologically. This opened the door to some remarkable additions to the fasting table, creatures we would never dream of filing under seafood. Porpoise made an appearance. So did seal, and even whale, all classified as fish on the technicality that they happened to live in the ocean. Certain wild geese were sometimes included too, thanks to a wonderfully mistaken belief that they hatched from barnacles rather than eggs, and were therefore technically not birds at all. The logic was flexible, the enforcement selective, and the result was that a supposedly holy fast day could feature a slab of whale meat in a richly spiced sauce. It's a genuinely beautiful little glimpse into how people actually live alongside rules, as opposed to how those rules are written down. The church said no meat. So the wealthy simply said, fine, and quietly redefined the boundaries of the rule until their fasting meal was nearly as lavish as any ordinary evening. It is, in many ways, the direct ancestor of every modern technicality we still deploy to keep to the letter of a rule while dodging its actual point entirely, dressed up here in Tudor finery and served with a completely straight face. So on a fish day, you sit down to what is supposedly your holy, humble, meatless meal, and instead find yourself facing a groaning table of seafood, some of it barely qualifying by any honest measure. You spoon up your porpoise or your whale, spiced and sauced within an inch of its life, and you observe the fast with impeccable technical obedience. Piety and indulgence, it turns out, could share a table quite comfortably, provided everyone silently agreed not to look too closely at what actually counted as fish that evening. The stitch beast. Tudor kitchens had a genuine flair for theater, and occasionally, a slightly unsettling imagination to go along with it. Enter the cockintrus, a creature that never existed in nature until a kitchen decided to invent it. The front half of a pig sewn to the back half of a capon, roasted together into a single, impossible animal. Cooks stitched creatures together, gilded their surfaces, and served up dishes purpose-built to make an entire hall point and gasp in unison. It is culinary special effects, a 16th century monster reveal you are expected to eat with a smile. By now, you've fully grasped that Tudor feasting was as much theater as it was dining, but the kitchens occasionally pushed that idea into genuinely strange territory. The cockintrus sounds like something out of a fever dream, and it was entirely real. Cooks took the front half of one animal and the back half of another, most famously a capon and a pig, and sewed the two together before roasting, producing a single impossible creature that had never existed until that kitchen willed it into being. Picture it arriving at the table. The front of a young pig fused seamlessly into the rear of a fattened bird, roasted golden and glistening, presented as one single, whole creature. It is grotesque and impressive in almost equal measure, the sort of thing that makes you lean forward and stare, trying to work out exactly where one animal ends and the other begins. The entire goal was precisely that reaction, astonishment, a flicker of unease, and a great deal of admiring conversation carrying on long after the plate was cleared. The cockintrus was simply the headline act. Tudor kitchens delighted in this style of invention, stitching creatures together, disguising one food as another entirely, gilding surfaces with real gold leaf, constructing elaborate edible illusions that tricked and delighted the eye at once. Think of it as culinary special effects, the 16th century version of the spectacle we now expect from screens rather than plates. A modern blockbuster wants to leave you gasping at something impossible. A Tudor kitchen wanted the exact same reaction, achieved with a needle, some thread, and a genuinely confident cook. There was real skill hiding inside all this theater, too. Fusing two animals convincingly, roasting them evenly despite their very different natures, presenting the whole thing so it held together on the platter, all of it demanded serious kitchen craft. A cook capable of producing a flawless cockintrice was worth boasting about, and the dish itself did that boasting on his behalf. For you, the guest, the experience sits somewhere between delighted and mildly disturbed. You're meant to marvel, to point, to appreciate both the cleverness and the audacity of the thing, and you do. But there's also a small, honest part of you regarding this pig-chicken hybrid with a flicker of genuine alarm, wondering at the imagination behind it and the evening that now expects you to eat it. So you take your place before the glistening, impossible beast, admire it exactly as you're meant to, and quietly add this particular dish to the growing list of things you did not anticipate when that wax-sealed invitation first arrived at your door. Sugar sculptures. Between the great waves of savory dishes come the subtleties, and these are the true showstoppers of the evening. Elaborate sculptures made entirely from sugar and marzipan, molded into castles, ships, saints, coats of arms, and occasionally small scenes carrying a not-so-subtle political message baked directly into the design. They are edible propaganda, a way for the host to flatter the crown, boast about his own lineage, or make a pointed statement in the most expensive medium available to him. You are meant to admire them first, and only eventually eat them, quietly grasping that you've just watched someone construct a small edible cathedral purely to remind the entire hall exactly how important he is. Between the great waves of savory food comes a very different kind of marvel, and these truly are the showstoppers of the Tudor table. They were called subtleties, a wonderfully ironic name for objects that were anything but subtle. A subtlety was an elaborate sculpture crafted from sugar, marzipan, and other sweet materials, shaped into astonishing forms and placed before the guests to be admired long before anyone considered actually eating it. The forms these sculptures took were genuinely remarkable. Castles complete with towers and battlements, full-rigged ships, saints and religious scenes, heraldic beasts and coats of arms proclaiming a host's noble lineage, sometimes entire small tableaus telling a story or making a specific point. These were feats of confectionery engineering, built by skilled hands over long hours, turning sugar into something approaching architecture and art. But a subtlety was never purely decorative. It carried a message, and often not a subtle one at all. This was edible propaganda, a chance for the host to say something loudly in the single most expensive medium available to him. A subtlety might flatter the king through carefully chosen imagery, boast of the host's own ancestry through elaborate heraldry, comment on a current political moment, or celebrate a new alliance. Guests were expected to read these meanings as they admired the craftsmanship, nodding along at messages hidden in sugar. The choice of sugar as the raw material was itself the loudest part of the boast. Sugar, as we'll see shortly, was a costly imported luxury, and to build something enormous and intricate purely to be admired, and then eaten was a genuinely breathtaking display of wealth, the equivalent of commissioning a full sculpture you fully intend to demolish by dessert. Only the truly rich could afford to treat something this precious as a mere art supply. So a subtlety accomplishes a triple boast in a single object. It displays the host's wealth through the sheer quantity of costly sugar involved. It displays his sophistication through the artistry of the sculpture itself. And it displays his ambition, loyalty, or cleverness through whatever message the piece was designed to carry. All of it packed into a single sweet monument that will eventually be broken apart and eaten. Few objects at the entire feast worked quite so hard for their host's reputation. For you, watching one of these unveiled is a genuine spectacle. A small edible cathedral, or a sugar ship, or a marzipan scene flattering the crown, set before the hall to a ripple of appreciative gasps. You admire it exactly as intended, decode its meaning as best you can, and understand that you've just witnessed a small act of theater whose entire purpose was to remind everyone present exactly how grand your host truly is. And then, eventually, this marvel is dismantled and eaten, its towers and sails and saints broken down piece by piece into sweet mouthfuls. There's something almost poignant in that, hours of skilled craft demolished within minutes, a small fortune in sugar consumed and quietly forgotten. But that impermanence was, in its own way, the ultimate flex of all. To build something this extraordinary and then destroy it over dessert was to say, without a single word, that you could always afford to build another one tomorrow. You take your sweet fragment of the sculpture, and you swallow a small monument to somebody else's importance. But all that sugar came at a genuine cost, and you can see it plainly whenever the wealthy around you smile. Sugar was a luxury import in Tudor England, and consuming it in vast amounts was simply another way of flaunting your wealth. So the aristocracy indulged with real enthusiasm. The result was widespread tooth decay among precisely the people who could least afford proper dental care of any kind. Blackened teeth became so closely associated with wealth that some historians believe certain guests deliberately faked the look, blackening perfectly healthy teeth on purpose to appear fashionably rich. So the glittering, honey-sweet feast unfolding around you is quietly rotting the mouths of the very people it's meant to honor, one candied almond at a time. We've already established that sugar was precious, but it's worth dwelling on exactly how precious, because it explains the smiles you keep noticing up near the head table. Sugar in this period was nothing like the cheap, everyday staple it would eventually become. It was rare, expensive, and genuinely prized. To consume it in quantity, folded into subtleties and candied fruits and sweetened sauces, was to consume money directly, another way of flaunting riches alongside the spices, the meat, and the seating arrangement. And the wealthy indulged with real, visible enthusiasm. Those who could afford sugar ate a tremendous amount of it, ending their feasts with sweet course after sweet course, treating it as the delicious status symbol it plainly was. The richer you were, the more sugar passed your lips, and the more visibly you announced your place near the very top of society. The consequences showed up in the most visible place imaginable, their mouths. All that sugar wreaked genuine havoc on Tudor teeth, and the very people consuming the most of it suffered the worst decay, their teeth blackening and rotting at a rate that far outpaced the poor, who simply couldn't afford to damage themselves so thoroughly in the first place. It's a grim little irony, the wealthiest people in the land, undone dentally by the very luxury that marked their status. And here's the detail that tips the whole thing from grim into something genuinely astonishing. Blackened teeth became so strongly linked with wealth and endless sugar consumption that decay itself began to read as a kind of status symbol. Some historians believe that people with perfectly healthy teeth began deliberately blackening them, faking the damage to appear as fashionably wealthy as those who had earned their rot honestly through years of overindulgence. Sit with that for a moment, because it's a genuinely remarkable window into how status operates. A side effect of luxury became so tightly bound up with luxury itself that people began imitating the damage on purpose. The rot became aspirational. The modern parallels here practically write themselves. We've had our own trends where a marker of privilege, or a side effect of it, becomes something people deliberately chase. A particular tan, a particular look, a habit that signals belonging to a certain set. The specifics shift across centuries, but the underlying impulse to display or imitate the outward signs of status, even at real cost to yourself, remains stubbornly and recognizably human. So as you glance around the head table at the grandest guests in the room, you notice it blackened, decaying smiles worn almost like ornaments. The glittering, honey-sweet feast so impressing you is, quietly, rotting the very mouths it's meant to flatter. You run your tongue over your own teeth, grateful for reasons you can't entirely articulate, and reach a little more cautiously toward the sweets. Drinking without water you are going to drink tonight, because water was widely considered risky, and frankly, beneath a guest of yours standing at a table like this one. Instead there is ale by the gallon, wine reserved for the wealthier tables, and hippocras, a sweetened, spiced wine that goes down far more easily than it should. Toasts arrive frequently, and refusing one is read as genuinely rude, so the cups keep coming. As the evening wears on, the hall grows louder, redder in the face, and considerably less coordinated. Somewhere down below the salt, a man is weeping openly about his horse. You realize, somewhat dimly, that holding on to your careful manners is about to become the hardest task of the entire night. Let's talk properly about the drinking, because it sits right at the center of the evening and shows no sign of slowing. You will not be sipping water tonight, for two clear reasons. First, water was widely regarded as risky. Nobody fully understood why it sometimes made people ill, but everybody knew from experience that it sometimes did. Second, and just as important socially, plain water at a table like this would have read as something close to an insult to the host's generosity. So you drink alcohol, and you drink a considerable amount of it. The options run neatly by rank. Ale flowed freely and in enormous quantity, the everyday drink of the age, served by the gallon up and down the long tables. Wine, imported and considerably more expensive, graced the wealthier tables closer to the salt, another quiet marker of who mattered tonight. And then there was hippocras, wine sweetened and spiced with those same costly imports we discussed earlier, warm, genuinely delicious, and dangerously easy to keep drinking. Each option signaled a little more status than the last, and every one of them was designed to be consumed in real volume. The real trouble is the toasting. Toasts arrive frequently, they're expected, and they are genuinely difficult to decline without appearing rude or standoffish. Someone raises a cup to the host. Someone else toasts the king. Another guest of honor gets his own round. Courtesy demands you drink along each time, and the social machinery of the feast keeps the cups arriving whether or not your body is remotely ready for another one. Declining too often marks you unmistakably as a poor guest, so the alcohol accumulates steadily, hour after hour, and the entire character of the hall shifts around you. The noise swells. Faces flush red from heat and drink together. Voices grow louder and considerably less careful. Laughter turns sharper, gestures broader. The careful decorum of the early evening begins, slowly and then not so slowly, to come apart at the seams. What began as a stately, formal gathering is warming steadily into something far rowdier, and the trajectory only ever heads one direction. Down below the salt, where the ale flows fastest and manners loosen soonest, the scenes turn genuinely, recognizably human. A man weeps quietly about his horse, or his debts, or some grievance nobody actually asked to hear about. Arguments flare over nothing at all. Someone begins singing who really, truly shouldn't. The drink has done its ancient work, dissolving inhibition and dignity in roughly equal measure, and the lower reaches of the hall have become a candid, unfiltered portrait of humanity several cups past sensible. And here is your own particular problem. Everything about this evening has functioned as a test of your manners, and the drink is now actively conspiring against you passing it. All those careful rules, the neat fingers, the quiet chewing, the modest reaching, the perfectly timed bow grow harder to maintain with every toast you're obliged to answer. The alcohol loosening everyone else's control is loosening yours in exactly the same way, and you must somehow stay composed while the whole room gently tilts around you. So you face the hardest challenge of the night, drinking enough to remain a gracious, sociable guest, without drinking so much that you become the cautionary tale the courtesy books explicitly warned about, the man weeping about his own horse. You pace yourself where you possibly can, answer the toasts you truly cannot avoid, and cling tightly to your fraying dignity as the hall roars on around you. It's a delicate act of self-control performed entirely under the influence, and plenty of guests nearby, you notice, have already lost the battle entirely. The entertainment never stops while you eat. You are also being entertained, whether you particularly want to be or not. Up in the minstrel's gallery, musicians play through the entire length of the feast, their tunes fighting constantly to be heard over several hundred chewing, shouting guests. There are fools and jesters delivering jokes that range from genuinely clever to faintly alarming. Tumblers perform between the tables, and sometimes a full mask unfolds, complete with costumes and dancing. It is dinner and a show combined, except the show never actually pauses, and the volume only ever climbs. By the third hour, the relentless cheerfulness begins to feel less like entertainment and more like a gentle assault on your senses. Look upward, and you'll find the source of much of the noise. Great halls often included a raised minstrel's gallery, built specifically for musicians to play from throughout the entire evening. This wasn't a brief musical interlude before dinner. It was a continuous soundtrack. Hour after hour of playing meant to fill the hall with sound and signal. Once again, the host's ability to keep skilled musicians permanently on hand. The music was as much a part of the display as the food itself. The trouble is that these musicians were competing against a genuinely enormous crowd. A great banquet might seat several hundred guests, all of them eating, talking, laughing, and increasingly, as the drink took hold, shouting over one another. The musicians up in their gallery had to project their playing over this roaring sea of humanity, meaning the overall effect was considerably less gentle background melody, and considerably more a constant, determined struggle between the players and the crowd. Everyone, essentially, was loud all at once, all night long. Music was only the beginning of the entertainment on offer. There were fools and jesters, professional entertainers whose entire job was to amuse the hall through wit, mockery, and physical antics. Their material ranged from genuinely clever wordplay to jokes that veered surprisingly close to the bone, needling powerful guests in ways that would have been genuinely dangerous coming from anyone else in the room. A skilled fool walked a careful line, and part of the audience's enjoyment lay in watching exactly how far he dared to push it. Beyond the fools came the physical acts. Tumblers and acrobats performed feats of agility weaving between and around the long tables. There might be trained animals, displays of skill, or any number of other diversions designed to keep guests entertained through the long hours of eating. And at the grandest occasions of all, there was the mask, an elaborate performance combining costume, music, and dance, sometimes drawing the guests themselves directly into the spectacle. The whole evening, in short, was engineered to be a feast for every sense at once, dinner and a show, with one crucial difference. The show never actually stopped. There was no pause, no intermission, no single moment of real quiet. From the first course through to the last suite, something was always happening, always playing, always demanding a share of your attention. That relentlessness was, itself, the entire point. A great host filled every available moment with spectacle to prove that his hospitality knew no limits and required no rest. But relentless is relentless, and there is a limit to how much cheerful bombardment human senses can genuinely absorb. By the third hour, with the music still fighting the crowd, the jesters still cracking wise, the tumblers still tumbling, and the noise never once dipping, the entertainment begins to shift in your perception. What felt delightful at the start becomes, gradually, a kind of gentle assault, a wall of sound and motion and forced merriment pressing in on you from every direction at once. So you sit in the middle of it all, full of meat and wine, ears ringing with music and shouting, watching the fools and tumblers carry on their tireless work, and you feel the particular exhaustion of enforced festivity. It's magnificent. It's genuinely generous. It's a display of hospitality on a scale you will likely never forget, and you would give almost anything right now for 10 minutes of pure silence. The show, entirely indifferent to your fatigue, plays on regardless. You fix a pleased expression on your face and endure the fun, one relentless, joyful hour at a time. An army of servants look around at the sheer number of servants moving through the hall, and you begin to grasp the true scale of this entire operation. There is a carver, a trained specialist who slices the meat using an entire vocabulary of precise verbs unique to each different animal. There is a cupbearer for the drink, a panter overseeing the bread, and a sewer managing the whole procession of dishes as they flow from kitchen to table. Each role here is precise, deeply ritualized, and sometimes even inherited like a small sacred duty. You are not simply being fed tonight. You are being served by a carefully choreographed household machine, and every graceful flourish is another quiet reminder of just how much wealth is required to put a single chicken in front of you. Take a moment to genuinely watch the servants, because they are a spectacle entirely in their own right. A feast on this scale required a small army of them, each trained to a specific role, moving through the hall in a kind of practiced, unspoken choreography. This wasn't a handful of people simply carrying plates back and forth. It was an entire household of specialists, each carrying a title, a defined duty, and years of careful training behind every graceful movement. Consider the carver first, one of the most genuinely prestigious roles in the entire household. Carving was a real, refined skill, so specialized that it came with its own elaborate technical vocabulary, specific verbs reserved for cutting each different type of animal, a whole specialized language a good carver was expected to know cold. You never simply cut a bird apart. You used the correct term for that particular creature, performing the entire carving with a practiced flourish that turned simple butchery into something closer to performance art in front of the watching hall. Then there's the cupbearer, responsible for the drink, filling and serving cups with real ceremony, a role that carried genuine trust, given the ever-present fear of poisoning we'll return to shortly. There's the panter, who oversaw the bread and the trenchers, and presiding over the entire procession of dishes was an officer sometimes called the sewer, who managed the order and presentation of each course as it flowed steadily from kitchen to hall. What's striking, looking at all this, is how ritualized and even hereditary these roles could genuinely be. Serving at a great table was never menial work in the way we might casually assume today. Positions within a noble household carried real status, and some were held by people of genuinely respectable birth, sometimes even performed as a mark of honor rather than an obligation. Duties could pass down directly through families, inherited almost like a sacred trust. To serve a great lord well was itself considered a mark of standing, not a lowly job to be escaped as quickly as possible. Put it all together, and you begin to see that you're not merely being fed tonight, you're being served by a finely tuned machine. A household organized down to the smallest individual gesture. The carver's practiced flourish, the cupbearer's careful ceremony, the smooth, unbroken procession of dishes overseen by the sewer, all of it moving with a precision that speaks of long practice and rigid, well-understood hierarchy. The service itself is choreographed as tightly as any dance, and you happen to be seated squarely in the middle of the performance. And of course, like absolutely everything else at this banquet, it all doubles as a boast. Every specialized servant, every ritual flourish, every officer bearing an obscure title is another reminder of the sheer wealth required to run a household this elaborate. It takes real fortune to employ and train this many people for the sake of a single evening's dinner. The entire human machinery arrayed here to bring you a slice of capon is itself a display of just how rich and just how powerful your host truly is. Guarding against poison for most guests, dinner tonight is simply dinner. But for the truly powerful, the great lords, and any royalty seated near the head of the hall, the meal carries a genuine shadow of danger. Poison was a real and reasonable fear in a world thick with shifting alliances and ambitious rivals. So the great, and the appropriately paranoid, employed elaborate precautions. Food and drink destined for the most important diners were often tasted first by a servant, in a ritual known as the assay, a live demonstration, performed in full view, proving that a dish had not been tampered with. Special vessels and careful ceremony surrounded the host's own portions. If you happen to be seated anywhere near someone genuinely important tonight, you'll watch this quiet theater of suspicion unfold, dish by dish. This is a strange thing to witness up close, a reminder that at the very top of Tudor society, even a single spoonful of soup could become a matter of life and death. Poison was a genuine, reasonable fear among the powerful, given a world thick with shifting alliances, ambitious rivals, and inheritances that could hinge entirely on one well-timed death. When you have enemies with both motive and access, the food resting on your plate becomes a potential weapon, and dinner itself becomes something requiring active protection. So the great, and the properly cautious, often the very same people, employed elaborate safeguards. Central among these was the ritual known as the assay, in which food and drink destined for the most important diners were tasted first by a trusted servant. This wasn't done quietly or off to the side. It was performed openly in view of the guest, proving directly that the dish in front of them had not been tampered with. If the taster showed no ill effects, the food was deemed safe to proceed. The logic was grim, but perfectly straightforward. These precautions extended further, into the very vessels and ceremonies surrounding the host's own portions. Special care was taken over how the most important food and drink were prepared, transported, and served, with trusted servants handling every single step under close, watchful eyes. There were even beliefs circulating about certain objects supposedly capable of detecting or neutralizing poison, and particular prized vessels were valued partly for these imagined protective properties. The entire apparatus existed to place layer upon layer of security between the powerful and their own next meal. If you happen to be seated anywhere near someone genuinely important tonight, you'll watch this quiet theater of suspicion unfold dish by dish. The taster steps forward. The assay proceeds. The small ceremony repeats itself around each new course before the great personage will touch a single bite. It is solemn, careful choreography, layered directly on top of all the feasting, a constant undercurrent of vigilance running quietly beneath the abundance and the entertainment. There's something genuinely strange about observing all this as an ordinary guest. You came here for a celebration, a display of hospitality and plenty, and yet here at the very top of the room sits a quiet, continuous acknowledgement that a single spoonful of soup could be someone's very last. The same wealth and power filling this hall with food and music are precisely what make their possessor a target, and the assay is simply the price of sitting at the top of that particular hierarchy. It reframes the whole evening's pecking order rather neatly. You may have felt genuinely small tonight, seated below the salt, quietly envying the honored guests near the host. But those honored guests carry a shadow you do not. Their status buys them the finest food, the warmest seats, the closest proximity to real power, and also a very genuine reason to wonder whether tonight's dish might be their last. The higher you climb at a Tudor table, it turns out, the more carefully you must watch every single thing you swallow. So you observe the ritual of the assay from your own safer, humbler distance, and feel an unexpected flicker of relief at your own relative unimportance tonight. Nobody is trying to poison you. You simply don't matter enough for anyone to bother. The taster steps forward once more for the great figure near the dais, and you understand, quietly, that the price of all that power and privilege is a lifetime spent watching someone else eat first. If you're unfortunate enough to be seated within actual sight of the monarch tonight, the pressure rises to something close to unbearable. There are rules governing everything. You do not sit until permitted. You never turn your back on the king, which makes even leaving the room a delicate, careful backward shuffle. You bow, you kneel, you serve and are served in strict order of rank. One wrong gesture, one careless moment of forgetting yourself, and you've committed an offense people will still be whispering about weeks from now. Everything we've discussed about pressure and manners tonight intensifies enormously the moment a monarch enters the room, and you find yourself within his line of sight. This is the deep end of Tudor etiquette, where the rules multiply and the consequences of even a small error sharpen to a genuine point. The king was never simply the most important person present. In the thinking of the age, he was God's anointed ruler, and every ceremony surrounding him existed to reflect that near-sacred status. The rules begin well before anyone has eaten a single bite. You do not simply sit down. You wait to be permitted, because seating in the royal presence followed a strict, carefully understood protocol. Who could sit, when, and precisely where, all matters of exacting order. Helping yourself to a chair as though this were a casual supper would register as a genuinely shocking breach. Every ordinary action you'd normally perform without a second thought becomes, near the king, another careful step in a dance whose choreography you had better already know cold. Then there's the matter of your back, which must never turn toward the monarch under any circumstances. This single rule creates real, practical difficulty, because it means you cannot simply walk away from the royal presence the way you would leave any ordinary room. Instead, you must withdraw while still facing him, managing a careful, dignified backward movement all the way toward the exit. It's an awkward, nerve-wracking little maneuver, and fumbling it, tripping, stumbling, turning too soon would be noticed instantly, and remembered for a very long time. The physical language of deference never really stops. You bow, you kneel, you lower yourself according to elaborate, well-understood expectations. Service around the king followed a rigid order of rank, with the most honored guests performing or receiving each act in precise sequence, everything flowing according to a hierarchy that everyone present already understood without needing to be told. You are not simply eating in the same room as the king tonight. You are actively participating in a living ritual of majesty, and your own small part in it must be flawless. The stakes underlying all of this are what make the whole experience so genuinely difficult to bear. One wrong gesture, one lapse of attention, one moment of forgetting yourself and behaving as though this were an ordinary meal, and you've committed a real breach, not a mere embarrassment, but something people will notice, discuss, and remember for a long time afterward. In a court where reputation and royal favor determined nearly everything, being marked as someone who simply didn't know how to behave before the king could quietly damage your prospects for years. So you sit near the monarch in a state of exquisite tension, hyper-aware of your own every movement, mentally rehearsing each bow and each careful step before you make it. The food is endless, the abundance genuinely overwhelming, but you can barely enjoy any of it for the sheer strain of constant vigilance. Where a guest below the salt might relax gradually into the drink and the noise, you must remain perfectly composed for hour after hour, because the king is watching, and so, quietly, is everyone hopping to catch you slipping. It's a peculiar kind of misery, this closeness to power. You've been placed in an honored position, near the most important person in the entire realm, and it turns out to be the single least comfortable seat in the house. Every mouthful is shadowed by protocol, every gesture a potential mistake carrying a very long memory attached to it. You perform your careful part in this great ceremony of majesty, and you come to understand quietly that near the throne, honor and terror are really the same thing, simply wearing different clothes. The heat and the smell. Let's be honest about the physical atmosphere in this hall tonight, because it is genuinely punishing. Several hundred bodies are packed onto benches, inside a room lit by countless candles and warmed by roaring fires, with essentially no ventilation to speak of. It's stiflingly hot. Many of the candles are tallow, rendered animal fat, so the room smells faintly of burning dinner even before you factor in the aroma of unwashed guests, spilled ale, and enormous quantities of roasted meat. The air becomes a thick, greasy soup you can practically chew. Your fine collar is beginning to wilt. Your face glows. You would give almost anything for a single open window. We've spent a good deal of time on the glory of the feast, so let's be entirely honest about the physical reality of actually sitting inside it, because it is genuinely punishing by any modern standard. Picture the hall as it really is by mid-evening. Several hundred bodies pressed tightly onto long benches, packed close together with absolutely no notion of personal space, in a room built for grandeur rather than any real comfort. The sheer density of humanity is the first assault on your senses, and it only compounds from there as the night wears on. The heat is relentless and unbroken. The hall is lit by countless candles and effectively baked by roaring fires in its great hearths. All those flames, all those tightly packed bodies, all that exertion of eating and drinking and laughing together, and essentially no ventilation to carry any of it away. The temperature climbs steadily through the evening until the room becomes oppressively, stiflingly hot, with nowhere for that heat to go and no real way for you to escape it. Now add the smells, because they arrive layered and genuinely formidable. Many of the candles were made from tallow, meaning they smelled faintly of burning fat even as they burned. Add to that the aroma of several hundred guests who bathe rarely and are now sweating freely in the heat, the reek of spilled ale soaking steadily into the rushes underfoot, and the heavy, greasy smell of enormous quantities of roasted meat. Together they form an atmosphere you can practically chew. It's worth remembering the cleanliness standards of the age here. Regular bathing simply wasn't the norm, so a hall full of people wearing heavy layered clothing, growing steadily hotter by the hour, produced a powerful collective odor entirely as a matter of course. Nobody around you finds this remarkable in the slightest. It was simply what a crowded room smelled like. But to you, sweltering in the middle of it, the combined fug of tallow, sweat, ale, and roasted meat is a genuine trial, thick, heavy, and completely inescapable. Your own fine clothing, so carefully assembled earlier this evening, becomes part of your suffering now. That heavy doublet, those tight layers, that stiff collar you were once so proud of, all of it traps heat directly against your body, growing steadily more unbearable as the hours pass. The collar wilts. Your face glows red and damp. The elegant appearance you worked so hard to construct slowly dissolves into flushed, sweating discomfort, and there is genuinely nothing to be done about it except endure, and hope you don't look too wretched in the process. And you can't simply step outside for a breath of air. The etiquette of the feast, the fixed seating, the presence of important people, the entire rigid structure of the evening keeps you firmly pinned to your bench. Getting up and wandering off in search of a cool breeze isn't really an option, especially if you're seated anywhere near the salt, or worse, anywhere near the king. So you sit, and you cook gently and thoroughly in the greasy, fragrant heat of the crowded hall. The contrast with the fantasy is almost cruel. In imagination, a great banquet is all soaring rooflines and golden candlelight and magnificent food, and it genuinely is those things. But it's also, simultaneously, a sweltering, reeking, overcrowded box of sweating humanity, where the candles smell faintly like dinner and the air itself has become a kind of soup. You dab discreetly at your glowing face, tug at your wilting collar, and daydream with real longing of a single open window and one clean breath of cold night air. A problem nobody mentions. Here's a problem nobody ever warns you about. You've been drinking for hours now. The feast shows absolutely no sign of ending anytime soon, and there is no bathroom in any sense you'd recognize today. Leaving the table during a formal meal is awkward at best and forbidden outright at worst, especially anywhere near the host. A chamber pot might be discreetly available, a close stool for the truly fortunate few, or a grim, urgent dash to a guardrobe, assuming you can escape the hall at all. Mostly, you are simply expected to endure. So you sit, and you sip more cautiously now, and you quietly renegotiate your entire relationship with the concept of drinking anything at all. Here is the problem that no romantic image of a grand banquet ever bothers to mention, and it is currently becoming the single most pressing issue of your entire evening. You've been drinking ale, wine, and hippocras for hours now, answering toast after toast, and your body has begun sending increasingly urgent signals. And there is, in any sense you would recognize, no bathroom whatsoever. This most basic, universal human need collides directly with the rigid ceremony of the feast, and the ceremony, predictably, does not care in the slightest. The first difficulty is simply the act of leaving the table. A formal meal like this was a structured, hierarchical affair, and getting up to wander off mid-feast was awkward at best, and close to forbidden near the host or the king. You couldn't turn your back on the monarch, remember, let alone excuse yourself for an obvious reason at an inconvenient moment. The very etiquette governing everything else at this table also governs, quite mercilessly, your ability to attend to this most fundamental of needs. The facilities themselves, such as they were, ranged from limited to genuinely grim. A chamber pot might be discreetly available somewhere nearby, sometimes even within the dining space itself, which tells you a great deal about how differently privacy was understood in this period. The truly fortunate few, the highest-ranking guests, might have access to a close stool, essentially a padded seat concealing a pot underneath, itself a genuine mark of privilege. And there were guardrobes, the built-in privies of a great house, assuming you could actually escape the hall long enough to reach one. A guardrobe, it's worth noting, was no pleasant retreat small chambers, often built directly into the thickness of a wall, where waste simply dropped away down a shaft. They were exactly as unglamorous as that description suggests, and reaching one meant navigating carefully away from the feast, with the experience at the other end cold, cramped, and thoroughly unpleasant. For most guests, most of the time, the expectation was simply to endure. You held it. You sat through course after course, through toast after toast, through hours of entertainment with a growing private discomfort, waiting for a moment that might never actually arrive, managing a need your body increasingly refused to let you ignore. It's a small, undignified misery running quietly beneath the grandeur of the whole evening, one that every single guest in that sweltering hall was managing, in their own private, silent way. This casts your earlier enthusiastic drinking in a rather rueful new light. Every toast you answered, every refilled cup you cheerfully accepted out of pure courtesy, was a future problem you were actively creating for yourself, hour by hour. The social pressure to keep drinking and the physical impossibility of easily relieving yourself were now on a direct collision course, and there was no graceful way to resolve it. You drank because you had to. Now you suffer because you did. So you sit, and you sip far more cautiously now, quietly renegotiating your entire relationship with the very concept of hydration. You calculate whether you can risk another cup. You wonder whether some chance to slip away might present itself. You consider whether simple endurance is really your only remaining option. It's a deeply relatable human predicament, dressed up entirely in Tudor finery. A reminder that beneath all the ceremony and spectacle, everyone in that hall was, at bottom, just a person in an increasingly uncomfortable body, quietly waiting for the feast to finally end. The sweet banquet. Just when you're fairly certain the whole ordeal is finally winding down, there's one more stage still to come, and it happens to be the one the word banquet originally described. The sweet course. The party may move entirely to a separate room, or even to a special little banqueting house, sometimes perched on a rooftop or tucked away in a garden, purely for the purpose of eating dessert. Here you're served marchpane, that is, marzipan, alongside candied fruits, spiced comfits, and delicate sugar plate confections. It is dainty, it is genuinely expensive, and it is the fashionable finale of the whole evening. After a full night of whole roasted beasts, you end things nibbling small sugar sculptures like a very tired, very full aristocrat. Just when you're certain the ordeal is finally over, that you've survived the meat and the peacock and the sweltering heat, there's one more stage waiting, and it holds a rather delightful little secret about language itself. The word banquet, in Tudor usage, didn't refer to the great feast you've just endured at all. It referred specifically to this final sweet course, the dainty, expensive conclusion, the thing we would now simply call dessert. The whole enormous meal preceding it would have been called, more plainly, a feast or a dinner. The banquet, properly speaking, was the sweets. This particular banquet often came with an actual change of scenery. Rather than simply serving sweets at the same worn tables, a fashionable host might move the entire party to a separate room, or even to a special structure built for exactly this purpose. These were called banqueting houses, and they were sometimes perched on rooftops for the view, or tucked quietly away in gardens. Small, elegant spaces designed purely for the pleasure of eating dessert somewhere refined, well apart from the greasy chaos of the great hall behind you. The move itself was part of the pleasure. Leaving the hot, crowded, meat-scented hall for a cooler, prettier, more intimate space in which to enjoy the sweets was a genuine relief, and a small mark of real sophistication. The banqueting house offered fresh air, perhaps a garden view or an elevated prospect over the grounds, and a real sense of exclusive refinement. After hours packed onto benches in that sweltering hall, drifting off to a quiet garden pavilion for sugar and spiced wine must have felt, honestly, like a small deliverance. The food here was a world away from the roasted beasts of earlier in the evening. You'd be served marchpane, sweet almond paste, often molded and decorated with genuine artistry, alongside candied fruits preserved in precious sugar, comfits, seeds and spices coated in a hard sugar shell, and confections of sugar plate, a pliable sugar paste shaped into delicate, elaborate little forms. Everything here is small, sweet, refined, and given the cost of sugar, extravagantly expensive. This was the true height of fashion, the genuinely modish way to end a grand occasion. For a host, the sweet banquet was one more dimension of the same performance, a chance to show off the sophistication of his confectionery, the elegance of his private banqueting house, the sheer quantity of costly sugar he could still deploy for a course that existed purely as indulgence. No great host would ever neglect it. For you, though, there's a certain gentle comedy to the whole situation. You've just eaten your way through an entire avalanche of meat, endured heat and noise and endless etiquette, and now, exhausted and thoroughly, painfully full, you're presented with an entire additional course of intricate little sweets. There's nothing hearty here to politely refuse. It's all delicate, dainty, and precisely the sort of thing you have absolutely no room left for. And yet it's the fashionable climax of the entire evening, so nibble you must. So you end the night as a very tired, very full aristocrat, picking politely at sugar sculptures and candied fruits inside a garden pavilion, marveling at their artistry while your body quietly pleads for mercy. It's a strange, elegant coda to a genuinely brutal marathon of a meal, refinement served directly on top of gluttony. You taste the marchpane, admire the comfits, and reflect that the Tudors somehow managed to make even dessert into a display of wealth so complete that it eventually earned the name we now give to the whole affair. What happens to the leftovers? While you groan quietly under the weight of everything you've eaten tonight, spare a thought for where the enormous surplus of food actually goes. Vast quantities remain uneaten, and none of it is simply thrown away. The broken meats, the used trenchers, the untouched dishes are gathered up by an official called the almoner and distributed directly to the poor waiting patiently at the gate. It is charity genuinely expected of any great household, and it is also, quietly, its own small performance of generosity. So the same feast that nearly bursts your stomach becomes, for the hungry crowd outside, the only real meal they may see all week. As you sit groaning under the weight of everything you've consumed tonight, it's worth thinking seriously about the sheer scale of what remains uneaten. A feast built entirely on overwhelming abundance, on tables buried under more dishes than anyone could possibly finish, inevitably produced enormous quantities of leftover food, whole platters barely touched, meats half-carved, soaked and abandoned trenchers, all of it steadily accumulating as the evening wore on. And this mountain of leftovers was never simply discarded. Instead, it was carefully gathered and given to the poor. Great households employed an official called the almoner, whose specific responsibility was the collection and distribution of exactly these leftovers. The alms owed to the needy gathered outside. The broken meats, the used trenchers, The untouched dishes were collected together and carried out to a crowd of hungry people waiting at the gate of the great house, hopping for precisely this bounty. This particular charity was a genuine expectation of any great household, woven directly into the responsibilities of wealth and rank. A lord who feasted this lavishly was understood, quite plainly, to owe something in return to the poor at his door, and the distribution of alms was part of how a great house justified its own abundance to itself and to God. It was rooted in real religious and social obligation, the belief that those blessed with plenty had a genuine duty to share their surplus with those who had nothing at all. The almoner's work was a serious, genuinely respected part of running the household, but like so much else at a Tudor banquet, it was also, undeniably, a performance. Just as the food, the seating, the spices, and the sugar sculptures all displayed the host's wealth and importance, so too did his charity. Feeding a crowd of the poor at your gate demonstrated your generosity, your piety, and your grand position, all for anyone watching to see. The act was sincere in its own way, and self-serving in another, and both things were true simultaneously, which is often how public generosity tends to work. There's a stark, genuinely moving contrast built directly into this arrangement. Inside the hall, guests like you ate to the point of real discomfort, surrounded by more food than any group could possibly consume, treating rare and precious ingredients as mere spectacle. Outside the gate, a crowd of genuinely hungry people waited quietly for the scraps, for whom the leftovers of this single evening might represent the best, most substantial meal they would see all week, perhaps longer. That contrast is the entire social order of the age laid bare at a single gate, the overwhelming plenty of the powerful, and the desperate need of the poor, separated by nothing more than a wall, and connected only by a steady stream of leftovers carried out by the almoner. So as you sit stuffed to real discomfort, dimly aware of the waiting crowd beyond the gate, the feast takes on one more dimension entirely. Your gluttonous excess and their grateful survival are simply two ends of the very same evening. The same food, the same household, the banquet that nearly burst your stomach only a few dozen yards away from the difference between hunger and a full belly for people you will never actually see. Every excess carries its own reckoning, and the morning after a Tudor banquet was where the bill finally came due. All that rich, fatty, heavily spiced, sugar-laden food, consumed in genuinely staggering quantity and washed down with rivers of ale and wine, took a real toll on the body. The feast that felt so magnificent in the moment leaves behind a very physical hangover in every possible sense of the word. And the Tudors suffered these consequences with roughly the same enthusiasm they brought to the feasting itself. Consider gout, which functioned as practically a signature ailment of the well-fed elite. This painful condition, closely associated with a rich diet and heavy drinking, afflicted precisely the sort of people who could actually afford to feast this way on a regular basis. It became so linked with high living that it functioned almost as its own status symbol, a painful badge announcing, quite loudly, that its sufferer dined and drank like a genuine lord. To have gout was, in a grim sort of way, to have truly arrived, your own joints testifying to a lifetime of overindulgence. There were sharper, more acute dangers too. Food poisoning was a real and constant risk, given the preservation methods available at the time: salting, smoking, and a fair amount of hope, rather than anything resembling refrigeration. Meat that had hung slightly too long, dishes prepared well in advance, ingredients kept without any reliable way of guaranteeing their safety. All of it carried a genuine chance of making a guest seriously unwell. The same abundance that dazzled you all evening could just as easily turn treacherous, and a magnificent feast could end, for the truly unlucky, in a genuinely unpleasant few days afterward. And then there is the simplest consequence of all, the one that needs no historical explanation whatsoever, because it is entirely familiar across every century. The plain, universal misery of having eaten far too much. That bloated, sluggish, faintly regretful feeling of a stomach pushed well past its limits is exactly the same today as it was 500 years ago. Having worked your way through what amounts to an entire farmyard of meat, plus sweets, plus a small ocean of wine, you would wake feeling exactly as awful as anyone reasonably would. So the morning after finds you quietly paying for the night before. You wake bloated and aching, your overworked stomach protesting, your head thick from the wine and the endless toasts you couldn't refuse. Perhaps you feel genuinely unwell, wondering nervously whether something you ate has turned against you. The magnificent memories of the feast, the peacock, the sugar sculptures, the endless meat now compete quite directly with the very real physical wreckage they've left behind. In the cold light of morning, you find yourself reconsidering a few of your choices from the night before. That impossible pig-chicken hybrid, marveled at and eaten with such theatrical delight, seems considerably less charming now that your stomach is staging its own quiet revolt. The whole roasted songbirds, the fifth cup of hippocras, the second helping of that intensely spiced dish, each one rises up in memory now as a small mistake whose consequences you're currently, uncomfortably enduring. It's a deeply human and deeply relatable end to the whole spectacle. Strip away the tapestries and the sumptuary laws and the elaborate etiquette, and you're left with the oldest story there is: someone who ate and drank far too much at a party and woke up thoroughly regretting it. The Tudors, for all their finery and ceremony, were just as capable of overdoing it as anyone at any celebration since, and they suffered for it in exactly the same way, bloated and aching, swearing dubious vows of future restraint. The real game being played. Beneath all the feathers and sugar and grease, a Tudor banquet was never really about the food at all. It was politics with a menu attached. This was where alliances were quietly forged, marriages gently hinted at, favor carefully sought, and rivals sized up over a shared cup. Where you sat, who chose to speak with you, whether the host acknowledged you at all. Every detail was noted, weighed, and remembered. Every single guest was performing, and everyone in turn was watching everyone else's performance. You came for dinner, but you were actually navigating a battlefield of ambition and reputation, armed with nothing more than good manners and a rapidly disintegrating trencher. Now that you've survived the whole ordeal, it's worth understanding what it was truly all for. Because beneath all the feathers, the sugar, and the grease, a Tudor banquet was never really about the food. The food was the medium, never the actual message. What was genuinely happening across those long tables was politics, ambition, and the constant, careful jockeying for position that defined life among the powerful. The feast was simply the arena where all of that quietly played out, dressed in its very finest clothes. Everything you experienced tonight was, at bottom, a social and political instrument. This was where alliances between families were forged and strengthened over shared dishes, where potential marriages were quietly hinted at and gently explored, where favor was sought from the powerful and granted or withheld in return, sometimes without a single word being spoken directly about it. Rivals sized one another up over shared cups. Deals were suggested in passing. Loyalties were tested. Reputations were quietly enhanced, or just as quietly damaged. The entire glittering apparatus of the feast existed to grease the machinery of power, and every small detail you might have taken for mere ceremony was, in truth, loaded with real meaning. Where you sat, above or below that all-important salt, announced your standing to the entire room without a word. Who chose to speak with you, and who pointedly did not, signaled the current state of your connections to anyone paying attention. Whether the host acknowledged you at all, and how warmly he did it, could raise or lower your standing in the eyes of everyone watching. Nothing at this table was ever truly neutral. Everything was information, read and interpreted by a room full of ambitious people who had spent their entire lives learning exactly how to read it. Because of this, every single guest was performing, whether they fully realized it or not. Your careful manners, your appropriate clothing, your composure near the king, your graceful handling of the shared dishes, All of it was a performance of your worth, your breeding, your fitness for the company you were keeping tonight. And while you performed, you were also, simultaneously, an audience, watching everyone else perform in turn, quietly nodding who faltered and who shone, gathering your own small store of intelligence for later use. This reframes the entire evening in a rather exhausting new light. All those rules that seemed like fussy, arbitrary etiquette were actually the terms of a genuinely high-stakes game. A lapse in manners was never merely embarrassing. It was a strategic loss, a small crack in the image you were carefully projecting to people who might, one day, help or harm your fortunes. The pressure you felt all night, the constant quiet vigilance, was simply the entirely reasonable response to being watched and judged by a room full of people whose opinions genuinely mattered to your future. So you came for dinner tonight, but what you were actually doing the entire time was navigating a battlefield. One fought not with weapons, but with seating charts, careful conversations, small gestures, and reputations built or broken in an instant. Your armor was your good manners. Your position on the field was your assigned seat. Your strategy was the careful, constant management of every impression you made. The stakes were your standing, your connections, and your future prospects, all of them quietly in play across a meal disguised, for everyone's comfort as mere hospitality. Understanding all this, the whole strange, exhausting, uncomfortable spectacle finally makes complete sense. Why the seating mattered so intensely. Why a single wrong gesture carried such weight. Why the etiquette felt so relentless and the pressure so constant and unyielding. It was never really about enjoying a nice dinner. It was about surviving, and if you were skilled and reasonably fortunate, quietly advancing. In a world where a single shared cup could seal an alliance, and one fumbled bow could cost you dearly for years afterward. The journey home. At last, mercifully, it ends. You gather yourself, offer your careful farewells, and step out into the cold night air, which after that sweltering hall feels like nothing short of a genuine miracle. The journey home unfolds in darkness, lit only by torches, and you arrive in a peculiar state that any survivor of a great party would instantly recognize. Full, drunk, exhausted, and quietly, deeply relieved to have made it through the whole evening without insulting anyone important, or ending up on the wrong side of that all-important salt. The final sweets have been nibbled. The last toast has been drunk. The entertainment has wound gradually down, and the great gathering begins, at last, to disperse. You gather yourself, muster whatever dignity has survived so many hours and so much wine, and offer your careful farewells, mindful of protocol right up until the very last moment. And then you step out through the doors and into the cold night air, which, after that sweltering, reeking, roaring hall, feels like nothing short of a small miracle. That first clean breath is genuinely extraordinary. After hours spent in the greasy heat, the crush of bodies, the smell of tallow and sweat and roasted meat, the simple cold and quiet of the outside world arrives as a profound relief. The pressure lifts. The noise falls away behind you. And for the first time all evening, you can simply exist without being watched, without being judged, without being obliged to perform for anyone at all. The journey home unspools slowly in darkness, lit only by scattered torches, and you make your way through it in a peculiar state that any survivor of a truly great party would instantly recognize. You're full to the point of real discomfort, drunk from the endless string of toasts, and bone-tired from hours of vigilance and ceremony. And beneath all of it runs a quiet, powerful current of relief, the deep, genuine satisfaction of having made it through without disaster. You survived, and tonight, survival itself feels like a real achievement. You take stock as your horse plods steadily through the mud. You didn't insult anyone important. You didn't fumble a bow before the king or turn your back at the wrong moment. You navigated the shared cups and shared dishes without disgracing yourself. You answered your toasts, held your manners together even as the heat and the wine conspired steadily against you. And crucially, You sat exactly where you were placed without a single incident, never once confused about which side of that all-important salt you truly belonged on. By the standards of an evening like this, that genuinely counts as a triumph. As the miles pass slowly beneath you, you find yourself reflecting on the strange spectacle you've just endured. And strange really is the only honest word for it. It was glory, the soaring hall, the tapestries, the astonishing food, the sheer overwhelming abundance of it all. It was gluttony, the meat, the sugar, the wine, the eating and drinking pushed far past any sensible limit. It was terror, the etiquette, the surveillance, the constant, quiet fear of a misstep before people who genuinely mattered. And it was theater, every single guest performing, every gesture carefully weighed, the whole affair a play about power dressed up, for one night only, as a simple dinner. You came, you ate, you performed, and somehow, against the odds, you made it out entirely intact. And that neatly captures the whole peculiar truth of the Tudor banquet. It was never the warm, indulgent celebration a modern imagination might picture. It was a demanding, exhausting, genuinely high-stakes ordeal, wrapped carefully in magnificence, an event you didn't so much enjoy as endure and ultimately survive. The glory was entirely real. But so always was the cost, paid quietly in money, comfort, dignity, and nerve. So you ride on through the darkness toward your own bed, full and drunk and weary and quietly, privately proud, carrying with you the memory of feathers and sugar and firelight and fear in equal measure. Behind you, the great house glows on, already turning its thoughts toward its next display of endless importance. Ahead lies sleep, and the bloated, aching morning that surely awaits. But for now, there is only the cold night air, the plodding horse beneath you, the mud, and the deep, uncomplicated relief of a guest who walked into the machine, played his part as well as he could, and walked back out again in one piece. Closing. So there you have it. You survived a Tudor banquet, and honestly, that is no small thing at all. You traveled a filthy road in your very finest clothes, found your place at the mercy of a single silver salt cellar, and ate your way through an entire farmyard using nothing but your bare hands. You admired a peacock that tasted, by most accounts, like a leather boot. You marveled at a pig stitched improbably to a chicken. You nibbled quietly at a small cathedral made of sugar. You sweated through the heat, endured the noise, and held your manners together through cup after cup of wine, navigating a room full of ambition armed with nothing but good behavior and a soggy slice of bread. You performed, you endured, and you made it home in one piece. It's easy, looking back, to see only the absurdity in all of it, the rotting teeth worn almost like jewelry, the feathered birds nobody actually wanted to eat, the sheer exhausting theater running through the entire evening. But behind all that excess were real people, navigating a world where a single shared cup could seal a lasting alliance, and one fumbled bow could cost a fortune built over years. They lived by rules we might now find genuinely baffling, ate in ways we might find alarming, and found real meaning, connection, and status around those long, crowded tables. They were performing survival, in their own way, exactly the same as anyone else across history, simply with rather more feathers involved. So tonight, as you settle into your own quiet bed, in your own cool room, with a private space and a bathroom just down the hall, maybe spare a quiet thought for the guests of that great hall 500 years ago. The ones who dressed carefully to impress without getting arrested, who cooked gently inside their own heavy clothes, who longed, just as you sometimes do, for a single open window and one clean breath of night air. Because history may be strange and gluttonous and more than a little ridiculous at times, but it's also proof that people have always gathered, feasted, feared, and hoped, one shared cup at a time. Sleep well,